Okay, so greetings to everybody. 1 second, one more person coming in. All right, so greetings to everybody. This is the 8th meeting of the theology. Next week is the 9th, and we'll complete Sacred Attunement. I was informed by Brian and others that I think that there is, the week after, there are no classes for undergraduates. However, I'm going to have it's an optional 10th class. I hope everybody, wherever you are, you'll be able to tune in. I think it'll be a nice way for everybody to kind of present their one-page presentation. But I understand that some people may be traveling. I think the university cut short the college 1 week over the reading period. But if you are a graduating senior or getting an MA or anything, I need to have everything in by June 5th, even though we'll be meeting that final Tuesday. Is that, everybody have that? I want that to be absolutely clear to everybody. And the only other thing I have, I think most people are pretty much up to date in papers. And I just wanted to make it clear that when you write your piece on Sacred Attunement, you write with whatever honesty and clarity you choose. There's no reason for anybody to feel under any particular constraints. So you find whatever you need positively or negatively to respond to. The main thing is that you're learning from it and you formulate something that works for you. Okay, so I don't want anybody to feel under any particular constraints. All right, so what I thought I would do as a lead in, I want to kind of recontextualize where my work is standing in the context of what we've been doing in the course. So to just kind of put this into a little bit of context, at least the way I would put it into context. Probably someone else would do it a little bit differently. So we began with 2 works by Rabbi Joseph Dov Soloveitchik as the first of 2 people who are theologians or major thinkers who are transplanted from Europe and who come to America and does something quite different than he did while he was still in Europe in the 1930s. And then goes on to do some fairly traditional things that he would have done had he stayed in Europe as well. So Soloveitchik represents Lithuanian Talmudism, a person who comes from the thick, full Lithuanian Orthodox rabbinic tradition. He comes he's influenced when he comes to Berlin. He's influenced by neo-Kantian thought, and he's influenced also in that there was a revival of Kierkegaard at that in the 20s and the 30s, and he's very much influenced by that as well in both explicit and inexplicit ways. Particularly in the notion of what we'll see as his notion of surrender, of taking a theological position and then simply surrendering to that position at a certain point. So he is, when he promises to do at the end of the halachic mind a kind of new philosophy of halacha, which would explicate theological and religious experience over against the halachic world, that is an incomplete or a non-completed project. We have various sermons and various occasional addresses that he gives where he responds to festivals or particular occasions where he does fill in a little bit of that. But the interesting thing is that when he comes to America, he essentially becomes a Rosh Yeshiva. He becomes the head of the Rabbinical Academy, and he no longer fully engages Western thought or engages with Western culture in the broader sense, or with the larger environment. So he remains within the framework. He remains within the framework. Someone who is ever not muted, someone please mute. So he remains within the framework. I guess I'm some feedback. Anyway, he remains within the framework of the Lithuanian yeshiva that's transplanted to the United States. And perhaps because he doesn't do any more theology, the sort of centrist American orthodoxy has not produced any theology. There is the only two people who were his students originally, who essentially did some theology and were interested in Jewish-Christian relations, were interested in larger political questions, Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg or David Hartman, essentially were marginalized by middle or conservative or mid-range orthodoxy. So essentially, that tradition has not produced any theological fruit, and his students who comment on him in interesting philosophical ways are simply commenting on that, but are not producing original and new work for our time, which now essentially is 50, 60 years later than when he was doing his work even in the 60s at the second phase of that.
Can I ask quickly?
Yes, Renata?
Would you include Michael Wischergrad as his student who does philosophy and engagement?
Michael Wischergrad could be included as an American.
Also, yeah, also marginalized. But.
Very marginalized because he too was involved in Jewish-Christian ecumenical relations and other kinds of issues. So that is a very problematic issue, the issue of reaching beyond, using all of the Western languages, talking to non-Jews, getting involved in political activities, involved with feminist or other kinds of issues that are on the table, went off that table. And that is, doesn't say anything to the quality of the original thought, but it talks about there is a different kind of parochialism when one could have expected something else. Okay, so then the other transplanted European is Abraham Joshua Heschel, who then represents Polish Hasidism, a kind of pietism, a mystical pietism, who also was trained in Berlin. And he comes to America and brings a whole other set. He actually expresses the crisis of the transformation coming from the Holocaust in Europe. And he tries to find the voice. He tries to find the voice as a teacher. He tries to find the voice as a theologian. He tries to find the voice as a neo-Hasidic articulator. And you recall when he used several times the imagery of the palace on fire. And the palace on fire does that mean that there is no God and there's no justice and there's no meaning in the world? Or does it mean that there is a voice that's seeking us out and asking us to do something? Essentially, Heschel hears that as God in search of man because God needs the human being to help redeem the world. But he is caught in the crisis of values of the post-Holocaust world, a world that also reaches out to Jewish-Christian ecumenicism. He was very much involved in post-Vatican II. He was involved with Martin Luther King, and he tried to produce a new sensibility and a different language. A certain type of response to what Heschel was doing then immediately appears in the first of the two Native Americans, namely Arthur Green, who was a close disciple of Heschel, studied with him at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and experienced that beginning of trying to find a theological voice in a Hasidic key, or the sense of piety, or the sense of responding to experience as a primary issue and a much open theological position. So Green also reflects the culture of the 1960s. He represents the openness of the university, which means that you're open also to the various methodologies, and he's open as well to contact with Eastern religions, which was a very powerful issue beginning in the 1960s, early 70s, particularly in the Eastern Seaboard, where we were friends and did things together. Green also, when he became a rector of the first of the Reconstructions Rabbinical College, came in contact with the naturalism of Mordechai Kaplan. And in a sense, his book, Radical Judaism, is a rejection of that reductionistic naturalism. And he tries to produce a kind of supernatural or theological naturalism, which is reflected, as we had tried to articulate, in the opening theology of creation. Green very much speaks in the I voice. He mentioned, you recall many times he speaks of theology. He's not trying to prove anything, but it's a testimony. And he tries to translate things into his language, into a new theological language. You'll be curious, we had an hour Zoom friendship session a few days ago. He's in Jerusalem. And I was mentioning a couple of issues that I was picking up from people here in the gallery and responses, and finding their own an individual voice. And his response was quite characteristical. He said, well, you and I didn't have this as a native language. We had to kind of adapt the language as Americans into the tradition. And people are going to have to take their own steps forward if they want to go that way. So he was not willing to give a kind of overarching statement, but really to talk biographically about himself, myself, that despite a very deep Jewish education and university education, making that language personally real as Americans was work that had to be done on an individual, personal basis. There's no formula for doing that. Green also was very much active in the development of new communal forms that developed in America in the 60s, communal fellowships. I was involved with him as well. People may have heard of the notion of the Chavurah movement, which is a kind of groups within the synagogue of their own prayer and study groups. That wasn't a phenomenon in the 60s, and this became a phenomenon afterwards as a kind of pushback against a kind of synagogue structure which people felt was just too distant, and using the rabbinic leaders as symbolic exemplars, like they were doing all the work and everybody would just sit and watch. And the issue of theological engagement and participation was something also from the 60s. So Green is very much involved in this theological revolution. I chose his book, Radical Judaism, particularly because the preceding works were all geared directly to seekers and not directed towards theologians. And I think Radical Judaism continues the work, but it's a much more focused work, taking theology as a discipline much more seriously. Therefore, I chose to have you read that, even though it came out 2 years after Sacred Attunement. But I decided to have you read that beforehand, simply because it follows more organically from Heschel. Okay, so now let me make a few comments about myself, so you can put this into some context. I'm also native born, but as with others, there is this kind of background that affects everybody's consciousness. So, for example, my grandparents are from Eastern Europe. So the Eastern European heritage comes in to the family, both in practice and mentality, sense of what the diaspora was, the sense of persecution. When I was growing up, my father was in the Normandy invasion and was shot in the Normandy invasion. So the notion of being an American, trying to participate and all the issues of the Holocaust and the invasion were part of my growing up. My father was the first commander of the American Jewish War veterans in Boston. So those are experiences of trying to be American, larger experience, but the complications of what it was. Just to give you another aspect, we recently found, when my father was the first commander of the American Jewish War veterans, he gave a speech in 1946 that he had been very severely wounded, and he came back from the Normandy beaches. And then he gave this radio talk, which and this is the way it said. So some of the language is a little archaic, but he said, "I want you to know why we," he's speaking to Jewish war veterans, "went to the European theater to fight the war." He said, "Because we fought for democracy and for the freedom of Jews and the colored people." Okay, that's the language that people used in that time. But the issue was what it was like to be an American, to have a sense of democratic values, and so becoming the theological climate was very much assimilationist of trying to become a good American in those days. In terms of other issues, my generation's among the first to be first-generation university students. Their parents did go to universities, but it was the first kind of attempt to kind of assimilate the huge European and American heritage that was being taken place. So as opposed to, let us say, Green's influence, some of the most foundational influences on me were both people like Cassira's philosophy of symbolic forms, through my teachers, Buber and Rosenzweig, were much more fundamentally important as thinkers, and the larger hermeneutical world, but also the world of Eastern religions. I spent many years studying the Upanishads, not as an exclusive thing, but these were not closed experiences to people of my generation, and they weren't just done in a casual way. They were an attempt to really try to understand these different theological issues. And when people made the choice to be serious Jews in the 1960s, the notion was that the Jewish tradition was strong enough to absorb it, but it had to be absorbed within the larger framework of everything that one was studying. So that was one of the great attractions through my teachers and Rosenzweig and the Lehrhaus, which I came to know very intimately, was that you don't have to reject anything, but you bring everything with yourself back into your Jewish life. And it is not just supplemented, it's enriched. There's a kind of deep dialectic between that. And let me just say in parentheses, I'll come back to this at the end, that was the primary motivation when I wrote Sacred Attunement. I wrote it essentially as a private letter to my two sons, who were in college or beginning graduate school. They were your age at that point. And because of types of things that were going on in America, I wanted them to understand that they didn't have to reject anything of a university education, all of the kind of complexities, to remain fully committed to a theological or religious life within Judaism. So I'll come back to that, but it was originally a kind of a private communication, and then other people convinced me that maybe other people would find it of interest, and I'll say a couple of further words about that. So let me make a slight transition. So part of the transition then is, what is it like for a person to choose to write a theology? Why would a person want to write a theology or choose to write it? Well, in some ways, either you feel compelled to write a theology or you don't. It's not simply a matter of choice, but the decision to write a theology depends on a certain notion of readiness, right? So I had spent many decades doing historical theology and historical scholarship. But I came to realize that, I think I might have mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but historical scholarship to some degree is to be a very sophisticated ventriloquist. That is to say, you have to channel other people's thinking and then put it into a language that is meaningful for method or for the times. So it's not a blind ventriloquism, it's a very sophisticated ventriloquism, but you're ultimately speaking other people's voice. And then I realized at some point that historical theology, at every point that a person was originally writing historical theology from early rabbinic times on, that voice was a constructive theology. They were speaking at their own moment for their own time. It's only retrospectively that the theological books you read is historical theology. Originally, it's personal theology, or it's responding to a contemporary moment, right? So I realized that required a certain amount of integrity and honesty. And then, when are you ready? So I figured I wasn't ready. I didn't have the purity or the clarity of thought. And then I realized it would never get done. And in a certain sense, writing theology is that act of clarification. It is that act of testimony and is that act of clarification. Because if you wait till the end, you're off the table and then there's no theology. So in a certain sense, you have to kind of either decide that this is something you have to do to say, where do I stand at this point? You don't have to write a whole theology book about it, but everybody has to sort of say, where do I stand at this point in my life to say something honest? So that's the issue of self-examination and the risk of communication. So now that reflects something, the notion of voice. And I mentioned this issue of voice because my voice is different from Green's. So you notice that Green was constantly talking about I. Okay? Now that's not an ego set, but he wants to indicate that's where he's standing. I didn't take that I voice. I think in the next two lectures, I will speak in the I voice because we have a relationship to some degree. And I will speak from that I voice. But I didn't take the I voice. But I want to express something that's crucial that I experienced that at least you can reflect on in your own way. Namely, if you're writing a theology, it has to have the authenticity of an I voice. It has to be you. You can't write it as if it was written from some abstract Kantian position in some cloud somewhere. Or you could, but at least from the 1960s on, you can't, or I couldn't do that. However, if you're only writing personally, you're writing idiosyncratically. You're only writing in your own idiosyncratic idiom. So the delicate balance, whenever you're reading a theology, is to try to figure out not only what was the primary insight of the person who's writing, because there's usually be one primary insight that plays itself out in many, many ways, but where is the individual personal voice that has to re-say it in a cultural voice so that other people could learn from it. And it's a very tricky issue so that you're speaking, it's idiosyncratic, it could only be written by a specific person, but you want to make the risk of talking to another person, or at least give them some chance to respond to that. The third issue that I wanted to mention, and that's the way I sort of begin the book, is that the challenge is to do theology. I chose a verb, not simply to think theology, but to do theology, which means that it's a process. And that whatever you think and experience has to be enacted. The thinking, the doing, the relating is all part of to do it. And that means it's an ongoing procedure. I think at one point in Sacred Attunement, or at a later point, I reflected on the fact that writing a theology is sort of like a prayer. And you hope that you can go back and reread it, but you keep going and changing. So therefore, it's going to be a little bit interesting for me to teach some of this material when I've already completed a new theology book, and it's now at the University of Chicago Press and won't come out until April. But I'm already slightly in a different place. I accept everything that I wrote, but I'm older in a different place, and I had to say things in a different way. So in other words, it's not like you say something and you're done, or you get to be 21 and you're educated and you're done. There's no doneness. There's no done there, right? You're always in process of growing and changing and trying to develop in a certain way. So I want to stress that. That means doing theology is a matter of integrity, because you're always changing, aging, learning new things. Life doesn't stop. And then you're integrating things in a different way, right? So it always has to reflect the kind of a fullness of this. I'm saying this to you because you're all doing the same thing from whatever vantage point that you're living and doing it. You may not sit down and write the whole thing, but any point that you're trying to assess your life in theological and honest terms, you're doing the same thing. It just may be more of a private communication or between you and some friends, but I don't think there's going to be a huge difference. And let me say one final thing as we make the transition to the book itself. And it was something that I felt very strongly when we were talking about doing green, and I actually mentioned this to him when we were Zooming together a few days ago, about this issue of the difference between sort of intellectual thinking and experiential thinking. And that I told him that, you know, he came to his theological position of unity, unicity, a larger vision of integration on the basis of very primary psychological and spiritual experiences. And I said that when in presenting it to students or listeners, they're not coming from that same experiential place. So they're hearing it and absorbing it, in a sense, as a kind of Kabbalistic schema, but it doesn't have the same integral balance between primary experience and the expression. So that's the point that I want to kind of use as the trigger. If there is any primary religious experience that underlies the book, and you see that the book in a certain sense is built around that core, but it expresses itself in different ways, is the primary experience of waking up from habit, waking up from formal practice, waking up from what one has simply inherited. And then it's not just waking up from that, it's what I use the term caesura or rupture. That is to say, something opens up where you encounter the vast elemental nature of experience and reality, not yet necessarily God or religious experience, but something primary, primordial, deep, and it's elemental. But you can't live at that level. And then there is this need to try to reformulate something that brings that experience into culture, into religious culture. How can you live with that deeper consciousness and do one's religious practice of reading or prayer or celebration, which becomes a way not only of living in that religious moment, but being aware of a depth that transcends any ability to fix it in language, any ability to kind of lock it in. So to begin to live in this kind of bimodal level between the caesura that breaks you open to something that makes you aware of life, death, everything that opens up way beyond symbolic forms and culture. And then I have to do this in a Jewish way. You have to do this in a Jewish or Christian or another religious form. And that becomes part of the particular articulation of something that is much deeper and more fundamental as a primary theological awakening or opening. So in various ways and in different kind of contexts, that is a core aspect of my own experiential core, but it comes to expression in different ways. But that's why that becomes a building block of allowing the theology to develop from making one's way through experiences to theology. So now let me begin to move more directly towards the book, and I will refer to certain kind of pages here and there as we move along, but I hope that you'll jump in and do a couple of things too. So I wanted to make it clear from the beginning that theology is rooted in forms of experience, but it's simultaneously rooted in forms of life expression. So there are forms of experience. There become forms of articulation and expression of these primary experiences. They can be at the primary level. They can be at aesthetic forms. They can be in religious forms. And then there are forms of life that are embodied in religious culture. And part of the concern is to link up these various forms of primary experience, forms of articulation and giving them expression both in words and in action, and giving them kind of a theological resonance so that one can keep those things in mind or live them. Otherwise, they're momentary experiences, right? Ancients, and I think I used the phrase, but it's a term that was used in the 19th century by certain philologists. The ancients had what we'd call moment gods, moment experiences. But moment experiences don't put you in touch with a theological tradition. They don't put you in touch with a much larger network of symbols. They're very private and idiosyncratic. So how do you move from these moments that can then become something that takes on forms of life and forms of religious expression that retains the vitality of the primary experience, or that will bring you back to that it's not just another form of articulation, but it retains the primacy, or you're hoping that it will remind you of the primacy. So part of the way that I wanted to begin was to articulate this issue at the beginning of forms of life and forms of attention and forms of articulation, and that Judaism is something that one performs, and you're creating theological expression at the same time you're reforming yourself from within. The exegetical work. Just 1 second. So that was actually a message from a person who wrote the biography of Heschel. So the world is caving in from different sides. Anyway, so part of the issue is finding a language that's authentic and real, and the exegetical act is not only extending the language of the tradition through interpretation, but because it's the self that's engaged in that, the self is being transformed. So it's not only the formation of the tradition, the deep reformation of the tradition, but it's the deep transformation of the self simultaneously. And it has to be done within a community, within a much larger tradition. Otherwise, these become isolated moment gods, moment experiences. They don't have the cohesion, integrity that all of us are yearning for when you want to have an integrated, meaningful life. Okay. So that is why I start the book with this issue of beginning with primary experience. Because what I want to do, firstly, I want to do two things. I want to show that there is no fundamental break between your and my life in the natural world of experience. And the natural world includes cultural and aesthetic and religious experience, and what we would call a theological life. It's not like I have one life in the natural world, and then another life in a traditional world, and another life in theology. But I'm trying to, in a certain sense, ground everything in primary life experiences. And through a gradual process of reflection and articulation, you can rediscover yourself within a theological tradition or the tradition that you grow up in, but you have to kind of refind or refound your language so that it works. So it's not another person's language, but the language resonates as a living language. So that's why that's why the movement is towards theology, because the towards is to first start with, how do you awaken primary experience? And from my point of view, primary experience is not disjunctive with what will become a theological experience. But how do you move towards that so that it is rediscovered and reconfirmed and reasserted in the language of the tradition, right? Right? That these experiences, if the theological tradition has holding power, Judaism or Christianity, what you experience at a very primary personal level will find a new expression in the traditional forms. And they won't be something separate. If they don't, you have a problem of staying within your religious tradition, or there is some kind of a dissonance or cognitive dissonance, and everybody's going to deal with that in their own way. I saw teachers and other people who lived with cognitive dissonance, and I took a vow when I was your age, I wasn't going to live with that kind of dissonance. So, but everybody makes a choice. You make a choice. And I made the choice, and towards the end of that spectrum, you want to say that, can the language within the tradition also be reinterpreted so it also resonates with these primary experiences, that they're on a spectrum. So therefore, what's foundational at the beginning is, if you jump to page 19, so I just want to keep our reference to the text. So that's why I use this term, caesura or rupture. That's just a term. It's a literary term. It's a musical term. But really, what I'm trying to talk about is that we've all experienced, whether it's in a positive life experience or a negative life experience or something breaks your head open. And you don't see for a second or a fragment of a second, the world just doesn't have, it's not same old. And it doesn't have a language. It doesn't yet have a language. You haven't come back to putting it into a poem or putting it into your diary or saying, this is what I experienced. You're just opened up to something very radical. And you realize that that radical moment is true. It's not necessarily wonder. No, it's not amazement. It's just some radical rupture in which you see through the fact that I've been constructing the world all along. right? Right. Like you know, I've been speaking prose my whole life and I didn't realize it, right? I've been using language. I've been constructing things. I didn't realize that my whole life, the culture, my language, everything is constructed because it came to me already with my mother's milk, with the family, everything. And I didn't realize that there's a difference between the primacy of certain experiences and that. I haven't closed the gap yet. May only be maybe a fragmentary moment, but that rupture opens. So then, and you're standing wherever you're standing. That's why I said I am, and I'm just here towards the end of page 19. So I just go even a little bit more. It says, where are you with the confession? Here I am. Consequent to when you restabilize yourself, you say, now I have a sense of awareness. But I didn't yet have, when that moment happens, I'm not an I, and it's not a world out there. Subject-object issues have collapsed. It's just an event. It's a pure happening. It's something that makes me aware of depths. And I can't even call them transcendent depths. It's just something that is so radically other that I'm part of, right? And then look what I say at the bottom of page 19. These experiences may fundamentally change our lives, for though primal depths may close over, because you can't live in that space, and we return to more regular experiences, the sense of depth may remain in mind. And if so, one is infused by an awareness of a twofold dimension of reality. This is crucial from my point of view. The pervasive superflux of existence that underlies our lives. You can call it God's reality, call it whatever you want. And its more delimited nature on the existential surface of things. That is the world that I construct, or is constructed by culture, the way I talk about it. Along with this, top of 20, along with this dual sensibility may come an awareness of our role in circumscribing the boundless and naming it. I become aware that I'm making a more parochial delimitation of this experience. That is a level of hermeneutical awareness and freedom. I've done this, or it's been done to me by Moses or Jesus, whoever. That tradition has limited something that's much more primary and fundamental. So this hyper-consciousness doesn't have to put you at the odds with things, but we have an acculturated naturalness. Now, we're not, that first moment is the radical nature of being in the natural world of exigencies, but it's not the acculturated naturalness that we necessarily have. And then you see in the opening paragraph on 20, it's the particular poignancy of the caesareal moment that changes us to a new mindfulness. You become aware of yourself as a different person. You become aware of the cultural constructedness of things. That doesn't reduce their authority or their authenticity, but you're aware that they have emerged also in spiritual responses to these primary moments of pain, of joy, of loss, in which it's just a kind of a blank moment that grabs you, right? We've all had that, and I'm sure that you're all thinking about something that has been fundamental. So for me, that throws you back to the primacy of breathing, the primacy of seeing, the primacy of what it means to be attentive. And that may be the primacy of thinking about life and death, but you begin to close it over, and the danger is to close it over with the same old. And the beginning of theology is when you don't keep the same old, you keep something of that deep, it's sort of like the waves keep coming in underneath the surface, and they keep challenging you and keep you there. So, and then you see at the bottom, it comes with a theological and moral imperative. And we're going to see how that plays itself out with art and then theology. already that moment says, where are you? Do something. How are you responding? What impact does that have on your life? We'll later see, I don't call it theology, I don't call it revelation, but that's what revelation is, right? It's that breaking openness that also says to you, as soon as you hear that voice behind it, the voice claims you and says, so where are you standing? What are you doing? What do you plan to do? What implication does that have, right? That's a moral charge, it's a theological charge. Are you going to live your life the same way? Or if you go back to your acquired naturalness, and you go back to your theological life that you've grown up with or you've acquired, whatever you're doing, can you remember that and not forget it, right? In what way is that primacy, in what way theologically have you been addressed by the divine voice, right? That is the divine voice. It's not just outside you, and it's not just inside you. It's that moment, and your response to the moment hears a claim. And it articulates that because you have to speak in some kind of a private language, but that doesn't make it any less God's voice, right? Because it's come to you from outside. And we'll see also that a primary feature of religious experience is not the autonomous act. It begins with a heteronymous claim. Something comes to you. From my point of view in this theology, and I think it's authentically true of authentic theologies, it begins by an outside claim. Something happens. It doesn't simply, you have to be ready, you may have to cultivate, or it may shock you into a new sense. I'm not saying everybody's going to be different. And I'm different at different times in my life, and so are you, right? If we're fortunate to have such moments that repeat themselves and make you honest. But the primacy is you're a receiver before you're a giver, right? There is a claim of otherness, and that's the thing that's saying, so where are you? What are you doing? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to change, right? So that's primary even before you get to these artistic levels. Let me just see if there's any other, just a couple of key terms. So on page 22, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to, right? You have to figure, I've hardly ever reread the book, so this is very interesting to try to teach it. But I'm finding so I did go back and reread it. But the issue is at the bottom. The double dimension is a crossing point. It's a crossing point. In other words, what I mean by a crossing point is there's a nexus. And that nexus point is where the elemental divine, as we'll see, crosses into the self-cultural. And that nexus point is primary, right? That's the first prefiguration of theology. It's not theology. It's not a natural, it's a moment of awareness that is on the way to theology if you want to go to theology. You don't have to go there. Stop here. Or become an artist. Do what you want. I'm not telling you where to go. But I'm saying that if I'm writing a theology book, it's a prefiguration of theology, but it's not theology as such. I'm not trying to make a universal claim, right? There's not one claim the way God addresses the human heart, right? So the starting point then is this opening up of the crossing point. The nexus point of a crossing is the point where I'm simultaneously aware of the elemental and the personal cultural. And they both interfuse, right? As we'll see later, that is all that means when God says, I shall be, right? Addressed to a person who hears it. But we haven't got to Sinai yet. Or not, we don't ever get to Sinai. We read about Sinai. That's why it has to be hermeneutical, right? But these are Sinai pivot points way before Sinai. Insofar as these are immortal, these are Sinai pivot points that lead you to Sinai if you want to think in these terms, but you don't have to think in these terms, right? But it is a prefiguration insofar as you want to see, or I want to create a trajectory for people who want to kind of renew their Jewish thinking or Christian thinking through this kind of a language. Okay, so that's a key issue. So that's the crossing point. Now, why then do I go to these other forms? Well, as I indicated, like the aesthetic forms, right? Music or poetry or the visual arts. In a certain sense, this has a dialectical character. This first moment is heteronymous in the primary way. Something happens to you. Call it God, call it whatever you want, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, whatever it is. In the aesthetic modalities that we've been talking about, right? The aesthetic modalities, the creative person feels themselves taking an initiative, right? They have to start with what I'm talking about at some primary creative moment. But the creative act is a formulation of this. And if it works at a threefold level for each of these artistic forms. This was crucial for me. That is to say, if you start with the visual arts, let's say seeing or painting, we talked about that, right? So the painterly eye tries to see the world both in terms of its known experience, but break through to a much deeper dimension of what form and color and shape and perception is. In other words, it's also that same simultaneity, but it's now done through a creative act. We'll see where theology works on this. So, and you become aware of yourself as a creative actor, as a person who's creating, who's doing something, right? You're responsible. That's the hermeneutical responsibility, your artistic responsibility. You're responsible, right? Artistic things don't just happen. Exegetical things don't just happen. Religious things don't just happen. You have to take responsibility for what you're doing to that experience, right? So when you're doing that and you become aware of the crossing point, that simultaneity, that I'm seeing the world in a new way. I'm attentive to it in a new way. I see the world and it makes me respond in a new way. Why would an artistic work do that? Because it makes you see the world new. You see shapes. That claim will mean that I have to relate to the world in a different way. But as we'll see in a moment, those are idiosyncratic, right? A poet, an artist, a composer is using their idiosyncratic, that's why I began with it, that's their idiosyncratic style. So you might become a groupie with that person, but you can't have a religious form with that person. It's too individual. The later move to theology means you have to become part of a community where that language is going to work between people. And you become part of a history of language and articulation. You're not just yourself. You can't factor yourself out, or that would be crude. And you can't factor yourself out because then tradition becomes an idol, right? So you have to find a crossing point. But the artistic person, let's say hearing music, we hear sounds all the time, right? All kinds of sounds. The artistic act is to put sound into a new sequence. into a new sequence of modalities, a new sense of rhythm and time, a new sense of temporality. And if time works that way, through music, I have a new sense of what it means to feel, what it means to go through time in a certain kind of a way, to experience rhythm in a different way. But it's someone else has given that to me. And I could become a groupie of a certain artist, and that would be speaks to me, but then I'm an isolated person, right? So you could have the cult of the artist of the 19th century, but then we're not talking about theology or tradition. You're talking about the heightened sense of genius or experience, or joining that in a romantic sense, the romantic of the 19th century, right? But religious traditions want to say, can one do this in a larger celebratory nature where the world can be changed, not myself, not just myself, right? But in all of these cases, what the artist can make us aware of is that crossing point. Sound is elemental. Seeing, it has elemental qualities. I don't necessarily, I see a gestalt. Why would I, when I shape it, I'm already shaping it, right? I'm shaping the elemental. I'm already shaping God's creation by what I see. Now, I may be thoroughly in a kind of a sleepwalker, and everything comes to me automatically. But I dare say none of us in the gallery want to be sleepwalkers, right? Or live our lives in a fugue state. You can live your life in a fugue state. You don't want to be bothered by a lot of things, so you can live in a fugue state. But I think the challenge of theology is not to live in a fugue state. The challenge of the university is not to live in a fugue state. But how do you, so then all of a sudden I become aware that even myself, I'm looking out at the trees. So I've shaped that into a configuration that is meaningful to me, may tell me how I want to live. It's not a 10 commandments. It doesn't have a sequence of imperatives, but it does have an imperative of what I can't destroy, what I must appreciate, how I have to be attentive, how I have to hear, right? Sight is what I have to be attentive to, what I have to hear. All these are primary things. That's why the aesthetic is also a prefiguration, of theology. Because you become aware of yourself and the much vaster elemental. We're not yet calling it God. We haven't yet got to theology yet, let alone Jewish theology. So insofar as we're talking about something universal, that's how I'm beginning. And I'm not beginning with a theology of creation, but I'm beginning with primary experiences in the world that make you aware that you're alive, that you're receiving things, that you're transforming them in consciousness, that you're transforming them in your heart, that you're giving language to it. And you're starting at that level. And part of the reason also, from my point of view, of talking about rupture and caesura is because it also makes you aware that I grew up with this language, with this tradition, with these parents, with these concerns. But for a fragment of a moment, I'm aware that it's been constructed. It doesn't make it less authentic, authoritative, compelling, maybe even absolute. I'm not saying any of that yet, or at all. I wouldn't even begin to say that. But I become aware that the caesura there's a suspension of spiritual awareness that brings me back to see in a new way, to hear in a new way, to talk in a new way. What else does the Decalogue do? What else does a religious tradition do except through a certain series of filters, help you see in a new way, or sustain a type of seeing in a new way, to hear in a new way, and sustain that way of hearing in a new way, to speak in a new way, to celebrate, right? To know the difference between the drivel and the rotten, and the sacred and things that have to be preserved, right? So you're on the way to this. First, you have to awaken in yourself. It doesn't mean that you're simply having aha experiences. This is simply a propedeutic, a way of beginning to think. First, I move this way, then we move towards artistic things, so I can become aware of the singularity of choosing. To become a religious person and theological, you make the choice. This is going to affect my life, right? It chooses you, but I can dodge it. Why would it affect my life? Why do I choose to let that have a claim, right? So I'm on the way towards theology, right? That's why the aesthetic is the second prefiguration. We'll come back to this if you have questions. So the first is just you and yourself. And then we begin to reflect on sort of cultural forms, which you may do yourself, but we reflect on them as cultural forms, which also can break you open, which the artistic person breaks open, or gives to you not just as an event of experience, but as an event of reflection. What it means to reflect on art. What does it mean to reflect on music? To reflect on, it means to become aware. Creativity is a forming, right? It's a forming of the tohu vavohu. It's a forming. God creates tohu vavohu, but what are you doing with it, right? Right? It's there to be shaped. It's a primary act of Genesis 1, right? What is that primary shaping? And how do you, so that becomes this movement, okay? So it now makes you become aware of something else that's fundamentally important to be a religious or theological person. Namely, not just the moment that happens, however it happens, that breaks in, the caesura that we're talking about, but when it happens to you and to me, right? You become, or I become, or you can become, or you will become, what's inescapable is the imperative of intentionality. I have to become, am I going to just receive it, or do I become an intentional agent? I become an intentional, what do I do with it? How do I respond? We will do and we will hear, we will do. All right, but can you say that at the most primary confessional level, right? So there's a birth when you receive, call it the gift of God, call it the gift of whenever that gift is given. Talk in Nietzschean terms, right? I don't know who gives and I don't care who gives, but it's being given, okay? But once it's given, what's being born in my heart and my mind is a primary intentionality. I see things in a new way. I have to address the world in a new way. I have to say yes or no. Right? What is the intention of that rupture? So for the artist, there is an intentional act of rupture too that goes back to try to break open the same old, right? Poetry wouldn't work if it just used same old syntax, right? Painting wouldn't use if it was same old pigments, right? Music wouldn't work if it had same old consonants or dissonance, right? Because then you wouldn't pay attention to it. It wouldn't call you to a new hearing, a new seeing, a new reacting, which is primary to become a religious person. And what I'm trying to say is that this is a primary thing that a parent wants to give their child long before they give them the tradition. How do you respond to the world, right? Now, obviously, you walk on a razor's edge when you're saying, well, I'm going to put some of these things in suspension. But the reason I'm talking about caesura and rupture is that for many of us, as much as we want to. So COVID does it. Deaths do it. Something does it that you see behind that cultural fog, behind the veil, right? And you see how hard culture is, even to find a vaccine. Look how hard culture is. It's not simple. Look how hard it is to make people healthy and safe. It's not simply a given form. Look how hard it is to speak honest information, right? How easy it is to lie. How easy it is to kid yourself. Right? So these moments make us aware, and that's a prefiguration of what it means to be a theology. It doesn't have to go there again, right? It doesn't have to go there. I'm not selling theology to anybody. But on that spectrum, it's a prefiguration. I can't dodge what it means to be a person. Right? That's what we're talking about. I can't dodge it. And I can't dodge it at two levels. I can't dodge the fact that I am me who is born and going to die. I can get sick. I can't control the disease that I can't see. I can't plan for it in all respects. And there's something way out there that's happening in the world. I see something new. Maybe I now see how easy it is for incredible genetic codes to go crazy and to affect people. I see something that takes me into a different form of consciousness. Right? I'm not thanking God, I'm not blaming God. I'm just aware of something so primary. I'm not making theological answers. That's closing the gap very fast. This is not a matter of theodicy to close the gap. It's not to close the moral gap. It's not to close the psychological. But we've been going through this, right? Right. Even if it's that sense of the radical sense of being alone, the radical sense of you're in your home or in a place, you speak to a person in a different way. So I'll just give you a personal experience about that. Sometimes it comes through your native tradition. Sometimes it doesn't. So when I used to live in Boston, when I was your age, student, I used to go with a lot of friends on Sunday to the Benedictine Priory that was in Vermont. That particular priory was very important because they were doing in the Catholic world what we were doing in Cambridge in the Jewish world. They were creating new liturgy, new melodies, and they were also very important to a lot of us because that particular priory, that Benedictine priory, was saving Guatemalan refugees when it was very dangerous to do that. They took a great moral risk, and that meant a lot to myself and my friends. And you don't have to be Jewish to appreciate that, right? So we used to go there for a number of reasons. But the reason I'm mentioning this in this context is that if you know anything about certain priories or Benedictine priories, is that they're silent except for a few minutes after Eucharist on Sunday. Or there's a few minutes in the morning when they gather together to talk about who's injured the other person morally or spiritually, to kind of to heal the brotherhood. Or at the other end of the spectrum, it's silence. And I remember, it happened several times, and I'm using it in this context of us being alone in homes and then thinking about what it means to speak. There was one of the brother's father, Father John, I remember. I was sitting with them outside after the services, and we were eating something, and they had an hour to talk. And I remember being overwhelmed by what it meant to use language after all that silence. How you had to choose words. Then what did the words of liturgy mean when you're living in a space of silence? Right? What does any human communication mean when the words come out of your inner silence? Right? There's a huge moral aspect of what it means to reveal yourself in language. This is a prefiguration of theology. It's beyond ethics, right? There's a self-disclosure, and the space is filled by something. Let's say it's filled by words or filled by something else. So that's what I'm saying, is that there are these moments. In that case, it was simply the atmosphere and the priory out by a duck pond somewhere in western Vermont, but it became emblematic of the depths of silence that is filled by human speech, right? So you don't have to necessarily have these moments in your native religious or psychological world. Otherwise you're really living in a very odd way, right? So that becomes a prefiguration. So then, I think if you go to page 33, I'm keeping my eye on time, we'll talk about for 15 more minutes before we take a break. And I also want to have a couple of questions before we take the break. If you jump to page 33, we move to the theological dimension. So theology happened, we're not yet talking about Jewish theology, right? We're talking about the emergence of theology from its prefiguration. A figuration of theology, let us say, right? It happens in the world of persons. It is a human truth. Theology is a human construction, right? I'm not talking about the primary sources. You can talk about what you think the authority of the primary sources are, and I'm not going to talk about that right now, but we will. But the theological language is a human language. It's a human truth projected into the mysteries of God's truth. Theology is a construct of thought and imagination. It arises within mortal finitude, but yearns for more, right? And then I go on, that what theology begins to do is to begin to take that heteronymous receptivity and join it to the autonomous creativity, but to do it to create an authentic stance within the mystery of existence towards ultimacies that tradition or your tradition or my tradition may call God, but you don't yet really know what God is just a term of the tradition, right? It's a primacy before it's a name, right? What is the primacy before the name? What is the primacy that the tradition is trying to claim upon you before you use fancy terms, abstract or more personal, right? So it's this. Now I look on page 33 in that last open paragraph. I would put it this way. So this is where we're moving towards the theological dimension. If in our ordinary experience, caesural moments seem to happen against our will or expectation, and artwork tries willfully and expectantly to create experiences of an elemental character, intentionally disrupting our normal habitude. Theology, here that's moving to the italics. Theology tries to transform this perception of elementariness into a sustained way of life and thought. How do you keep that in mind? How do you make sure that that affects you at every reactive moment or every living moment? How can the symbols of that after the fact keep you locked in to a decent life? Or a life that becomes aware of this depth while it's aware of the surface and depth, right? This weird thing of surface and depth, right? That yin and yang of perception, right? Is it foreground or is it background? Well, it's both. Things emerge and things recede. What's that middle point between foreground and background of those two yin-yang circles, right? Where can you place yourself there? Obviously in life, you're moving back and forth, right? The world emerges, I emerge, I move backward, something happens, right? But conceptually, is there a middle point that we can't locate, some kind of a divine middle point that's everywhere and nowhere? How could it be anywhere? It's everywhere and nowhere, but it's that place that mediates foreground and background. The given and the responsive, or my given and its response, right? That's the dialogical structure of existence. That's what it means, the Buber's talking about, or Rosenzweig, a primary theological dialogue. It's not chatter. That's what's involved here. So he said, that doesn't mean living at some abnormal edge of experience. It means taking a particular stand where the elemental and everyday intersect. That's crucial, right? What religious traditions will do through divine inspiration or whatever is to create language and symbols that mark out these crossing points. And if they're working right, those crossing points are what we really think about when we say something is sacred, right? That's the crossing point. It makes you aware that there's something at the boundary point that is leading you into the elemental. And if you trivialize it and you move away, it becomes profane, right? Foreground, background. The sacred becomes that middle point where you become aware, I'm at a crossing point and it's really sacred. It's opening me up to something way beyond this particular action or this commandment. It's opening up a dimension. If it isn't, you're living in this fog. So ultimately, the sacred is that crossing point. It's that place where you can't, that happens to you, and if you recede from it, it's the world of Chol, it's the world of the secular, it's the world of the profane. It can become sacred when it opens up and it reveals something. Religious traditions try to keep you at that boundary point because it wants to keep you at the boundary point of intentionality and consciousness, right? And it does so when it is speaking authentically. When it's simply done in a fugue state, of course it doesn't, right? So we're all at this point. We live parts of our life in a fugue state and you want to get back to something elemental. Or you're living your life and you want to move towards something elemental, right? But we're trying to live at this way. Look at the third line from the bottom here. That moment, that elemental moment, is the place of the radical opening of awareness. And you're aware of your fabrication, right? The fabrication may come through inspiration, make this tabernacle like this divine image. It may come through an instruction, but you're doing it. You're involved in its formation, right? Let me just make a couple of other points. We'll take a couple of questions before we take that break. So so what I'm talking about from that 31 and 33 and so on forth are the it's attuning the self to the elemental as such. This issue of saying yes or no. You're always at that boundary point. You're always having to make a decision. It's always normative at some level, insofar as you're alive with responsiveness, right? Then in 36 and following is a kind of a very difficult interpretation of Rabbi Azriel of Gerona, but part of this is to begin to give Jewish theological language to this very elemental issue, but to do it with mystical language, so it becomes a kind of, for me it's very important language, but it becomes a kind of transitional point from this universal on the way to theology to Jewish theology. So it becomes a kind of bridge into this specificity, moving from we call it the God's ought to the not, that play between what is and the not. The not is the fullness of all things. The ought is what is, but what also makes the claim, has obligation, right? And then you can see on top of 39, every actual theology appears in a specific cultural language, that it's a particular form of discourse about God. So that becomes this movement towards something elemental that I would hope would be within most religions that we could understand. And then you begin to move towards Jewish theology, right? And the Jewish theology then begins to give a particular language to all of this. It begins a certain way of not only breaking you beyond the crust of everydayness, but also to hold these things in mind through their performance, right? And so it works at two hermeneutical levels. The first hermeneutical level I've been glossing over, namely the hermeneutical level of what do you do with these primary experiences? How do you understand them, interpret them, give them shape and form? So that they're not just shaping the everyday, but they're opening you as a prism to the elemental, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't move you towards the theological, okay? Right. And then, now, the movement towards Jewish theology becomes movement towards this different hermeneutical dimension. Because we don't, we remain with primary experiences, but we start with the language of tradition. As we'll see, we'll come back to this, the written Torah and the oral Torah of tradition. And that gives a first order language. And then the struggle is, can that language keep opening the self up to these primary moments through theological interpretation? And if so, how? And when we come back afterwards, we're going to, so, you know, I talk about language as a place of divine indwelling, words as a place of divine indwelling, and becoming sensitive to that. And the practice of reading sacred texts becomes a new way of becoming attentive to words, becoming attentive to how words make meaning and make an implication on your life. And the fact that the hermeneutical freedom is that we have to constantly use language to develop our theological life. That's going to be, I'm going to come back to this issue. That's why what I call the Torah Kalula, this kind of all-in-all Torah, is fundamental. Because the Torah, the written Torah, is already a delimitation in the language of Moses. The oral Torah is a response to that in the language of the sages, and they're primary and fundamental. But there's a whole huge world out there that's God-given. God doesn't stop creating the world after Sinai and after the tradition. Ongoing, the world is still there, and it's still pulsing with possibilities. How does that's God's voice that's still voicing, right? How does that impact the way the rabbis are responding to the world and changing things by their reinterpretation of a theological moment, or the need of a certain halachic moment, or your need for a theological moment? Because the world doesn't stop, right? Has a theology of creation gone down the tubes now that you have revelation? No, obviously not. So what are we doing with that, even if the written and the oral Torah of tradition are primary? They have to be primary because they're the first conduit of that language, the first conduit. But if you're going to be a receiver, right, then you have to be a receiver in the active present. It's always being given, right? That's sort of the task of the hour for Jewish religious persons in these days coming up to the holiday of Shavuot, right? Namely, can you become a receiver again in a primary way? Can you hear in a primary way? Is it going to make a claim in a primary way? Can you stand at Sinai again in a real sense with the language of tradition? With the language of tradition, but with yourself and your friends and a group, right? It's not an escapable thing. There are many ways that the rabbis talk about this, that the claim of becoming into the present moment. We don't have to go into that at this thing. But this movement towards this point is the movement then towards Jewish theology, right? It's that movement towards the claims that we've been talking about, but now in the unique, particular way that Jewish language works and its claims and its sense of the sacred. As a stream of tradition, but one is still receiving, or otherwise it's a museum piece, right? What has been given has claim, but it has to keep, if it's not being received, it's not an ongoing revelation, right? It's simply there as a cultural artifact. So what theology ultimately is trying to do is to say, are the traditions more than a cultural artifact that have been shaped by other people's experience? And how do you then, and this goes back to the very, very beginning, right? How do you take your idiosyncratic self, your idiosyncratic language, and write yourself theologically into a communal language of the tradition, right? That was my task from the very beginning. But this becomes the ongoing task for any religious person who has written traditions, oral traditions, and themselves. And we're not talking about the authority to change. I'm not talking about changing things. I'm talking about how to receive them so they become living voices. That's all I'm talking at this point, right? So I have 11 your time. Let's take maybe 5-10 minutes for some first responses, because then I want to move towards this Jewish hermeneutical theology as part 2 in the second part of the class. So anybody want to kind of raise anything? Rebecca, you had your hand up, is that for you?
Yes, thanks. Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit about how you conceive of theology as something like complete or systemic, as opposed to like maybe like a theological statement versus theology as in like a larger theology. And I think a sense that I've gotten from your work and from some of the other work we've read is that part of the theological task can be to define that. So like in your opening, you said, you know, like, I can't just talk about thinking, I have to talk about doing. And if I had a theology that didn't talk about doing, it wouldn't be complete. But I was just interested in your thoughts on like what it means to do something systemic, and like, how do you undertake something like that, and how do you know when it's complete? And yeah.
So there's no simple answer, obviously. You have to trust the tradition, You have to trust that it is giving authentic guidance, and you have to trust yourself. And then you have to learn how to interpret. And that takes time. First, you begin with your own personal life, but then you gradually learn the claims that tradition can make upon you as you begin to learn how to read with the tradition as well. Then it becomes much more dialectical, right? But that's a slow, honest process, right? There's no simple way. Any one of let me just give you. I mean, it's happening all the time. So, just to give you a kind of interesting example that shocked me. So, remember when I first came here to TNEC and I was talking to someone in the synagogue, daily basis, person I see all the time. And they said, well, we don't do theology, right? With Orthodoxy, we don't do theology. So I simply asked, I said, well, what do you do every moment when you're praying? What are you doing with that language? What do you do when you read the text on the Sabbath? What are you doing? You're doing theology, right? You're appropriating the language. You're making it alive. You're trying to inhabit it, right? Right? I remember coming across a phrase that Chagall once used. He said, I wish I could find a place in my paintings that I could hide in one of the colors and no one would see me. Right? So it's, can you find those words and enter them? There's no simple, you grow in authenticity. But I wouldn't speak from the authoritarian point of view that you can't say anything until you get to a certain point. That would, right? You have to start where you are. Yeah, and that is already authentic. So any one moment is a theological moment because it's responsive and living, right? And any time you don't do that, you shut the door. You shut the door to language. You shut the door to your own authentic life. But you know what your life is. You know what your education is. You know what you want to do. You know who you live with and what has to be done. And that's all part of it. That's all that's standing with you at Sinai, right? That's that invisible congregation in your head, right? So that's So that's that would be my minimal and maximal answer, right?
Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody have any thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Who's talking? Okay, Lishan? Okay.
Yeah, so relating to the previous question, so is there any methodology for theology, or can anyone write a theology?
Look, any autobiographical statement has a theological claim. The question is, how do you grow? What is the framework you want to eventually write it for? Are you writing for yourself, yourself and your friends? Are you writing for your family, for a religious community? Are you trying to write it using academic language so that it also appeals to people who know the academic lingo, right? I mean, so this theology I'm writing is obviously crossing a number of boundaries, but it's trying to also not play with, it doesn't play with the language of academic formulations so that so that you're constantly measuring it against an academic framework, right? So you notice, I just want to point out something. People do, I'm responding to your question, but I did two things deliberately in this theology that you may or may not have noticed. One is In the text, I don't bring in any of the people or persons who influence me, right? So I don't cite this or that. Why? Not because they're not of influence. You can look in the back of the book and you can see what I was reading, what was influencing me. And I didn't even want to have footnotes because that's an academic convention, right? I did that because I don't want you to read this and to say, oh, so Fishbane's 2 degrees away from so-and-so and 3 degrees away from so-and-so, and that's all you're reading. Like, how do you fit into the puzzle? I don't think that's the way you should read theology, right? He's now 3 degrees away from so-and-so, therefore I can accept him, and he's 4 degrees away from so-and-so, and so that's a problem for me, right? But in the back of the book, key to the phrases, you can see a huge range of things that I've been reading. So that's to tell you what you have to cultivate in yourself. But I'm not going to throw that in your face, right? That's a part of what brings me to the statements. But that is sort of like the archaeology of my spiritual and intellectual development. And you can look at that as the deeper archaeology, but I'm not going to give you footnotes to say, well, you know, now it's legitimate, right? Or now Fishbane's speaking academic lingo, right? So you have to have the courage, at least from my point of view, is to speak in a voice. And for those who can hear and resonate, and it transcends boundaries, right? I can't tell you how many most interesting letters I have gotten from Catholic monks, not people from, right? And they refer to me as Abba Michael. So all these, right? So they're able to translate these things into another dimension, right? So people will hear what they can hear, and if they don't want to hear, they don't want to hear. Or they hear as much as they want to hear. And then, so this is a theology that's trying to reflect my larger vision and statement. But let's say 2 phrases, 2 words make a difference in your life, and you still have to change them for you to live with them. That's great. Right? The issue isn't to create a theological clone, right? The issue is that something would stimulate you in your life. Even if it's negative, right? Then you're alive, right? So those are deliberate strategies. Anybody else want to say? Yeah, Matt.
So this is in the very same vein as Legion and Rebecca. I guess I'm wondering what would distinguish this way of taking a stand, you know, at this nexus between the depth and culture. How would you distinguish that from philosophy, or yeah? So how would you distinguish theology from philosophy?
Well, within the space of 10 seconds.
Yeah.
No, all right. So the simple answer, but that's the honest, direct answer, is that the philosophical is abstract. It's rational and it's abstracted, and it speaks in the third person with a claim that this is what a human self can do, right? Theology doesn't have to lose any of its critical intellectual clarity and its ability to think, but it engages one with the primary mystery of life, which can be called the divine or God, right? It becomes this attempt to respond to what's ineffable, but that's making itself present to consciousness. It uses all of the critical aspects, but you say, can I live this? Not just can I think it. Can I live it as me? Can I live it as me with other people? Can I live it as me that fits into an organic tradition? Can I live it as me in an organic tradition that doesn't cut me off from other people? So those would be some regulative principles for me, not making an abstract, absolute claim that transcends myself, that doesn't engage the fact that, I eat and I sleep, and that I'm alive and I get sick and I die, that I have people I care for. And that's all of the issues that make me think theologically. It's part of this. But then that's how I began. So that's part of the idiosyncratic I. And then can you raise it to a form? There can be multiple forms. There could be a poem, right? There are a lot of Jewish theology has multiple forms. I tried to create a form, right? This form doesn't exist anywhere in the Platonic universe. It's a form that grew out of my realization that hermeneutical awareness is a living, growing thing. So I think, is that Ellie's hand? Let's take one last one. I think it's his telephone number. I don't know. Ellie, are you there? Is that you? He disappeared. So I have 11:15 your time. Let's take 10 minutes, take a breath or something like that. And we're going to come back and I want to talk now about Jewish hermeneutical theology and why I structure the form around Pardes, the 4 levels of Jewish traditional reading, which would have their correlates in the non-Jewish world, right? Many people have even said that these 4 levels first come in to Judaism through 4 levels of the church. We had already developed 4 levels. But irrespective of that, there are 4 levels of thinking and living and interpreting, which become 4 levels of living and doing theology. And I want to kind of talk about why I chose that as the form for part 2 of the book. Okay, so take a little bit of time. Let's come back in about 10 minutes and we'll keep going. Okay, see you in a bit. All right, sorry about that. So this primary moment of Sinai then begins to unfold through interpretation. It unfolds through its receptivity from the very beginning. Hebrew scripture is filled with ongoing responses and clarifications, words of Moses that re-explain and so on and so forth, and the prophets doing that. And this becomes part of an ongoing receptivity and chain of tradition. So Sinai is historically central, but whatever that historical moment is less important for a history of a religion than its paradigmatic theological centrality and its ability to keep addressing the reader with life experience, not just historical details and how much can be confirmed by an archaeological dig. That you don't get much of Sinai from that. So except what you get from it. So the I began actually. So I wanted to make that first claim about Sinai because part of the whole issue will affect how do you read and receive the tradition, and how does the form of that reception, that literary reception, affect new forms of life, that is your form of life, or the traditional forms of life of Judaism, and ongoing forms of life, right? So this formulation becomes significant for ongoing theological forms of receptivity and translation and life. But not only in terms of the scriptural narrative, but also paradigmatically, I wanted to treat Moses before I treat Sinai. Now that happens, of course, from a narratological point of view, but I think that from a conceptual phenomenological point of view, from the point of view of the history of theology that we're talking about, it's also important to see the Moses sense, like the Moses mind that one would cultivate from the Sinai mind. And that the two are modalities. There's an Adam mind, and then there's maybe an Abraham mind, which is different. There's a Moses mind that people adopt, and it can be a Sinai dimension as well. So why do I begin with Moses as a prefiguration of Sinai? Precisely because Moses' core moment is a caesural moment. It's that moment at the sneh, the moment at the bush, when something happens to a consciousness called Moses, and he's just hanging out there with his sheep, doing his thing, going to a kiosk, having a Coca-Cola, doing his thing out there in the desert. And then all of a sudden he sees something going on. He said, what in heaven's name is that? Or he said something else, I don't know. What in the flock's name is that? So he turns, and there's a rupture of awareness, right? There's a rupture of awareness where he's pulled out of the everyday. He's pulled out of this fugue state. He's pulled out of whatever he was daydreaming about, or just doing his business, right? Right? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, these are my flocks, and I won't let them go. And then all of a sudden God appears or something. I'm going to see what there is there, right? So he's pulled out. So this is a continuity of what we're talking about, this caesural or radical rupture that could happen before theology. Now scripture is inscribing that. And it's a moment that is transformative to the life. There's a before and there's an after. And the before is routine, like I'm just to have the God of the fathers, right? I'm an inheritor. But now he becomes a person of individual destiny. The Moses moment is the moment when you're not just have the God of the fathers, but you have the claim of a personal destiny. And you have to go and do something about this in a new way, right? As part, so he has to go, and part of that challenge is he has to liberate or speak truth to power, whatever he has to do. when he goes to Pharaoh. That's part of, he has a destiny that's larger than selfhood. That is a claim that happened in that moment. Right? Now, it's also important for this Moses consciousness that is also inscribed in scripture that we read and have to receive at a personal level. It's not just a historical moment, or else you can just put it in the, in the Bible museum somewhere in Israel or wherever you have a Bible museum. So you take Sinai and draw a picture of it and put it in the, but that's not a big deal. That's pretty trivial, right? So what part of what happens is that there's a new divine name that is directly related to the caesural moment, right? It's both the tetragram and it's also I shall be, right? So the tetragram makes a claim on being itself. There's something that has radically opened beyond culture. Something of the depths has opened up. But there's also a very specific moment of claim that says, I shall be as I shall be. The voice becomes personal. The voice directs the person to an individual destiny, right? So it's the two, it's both and. They both come simultaneously. They're both part, there's an opening into this vastness, transcendent vastness, but there's also something that addresses to be at a, God comes present at a particular moment as God chooses to be, as the moment makes a claim. And it makes, so then this type of Moses is transformed, right? And all we learn about this is the sense of destiny. We don't yet know anything about what's required at the moral or the celebratory or how you create a society, of how you protect life. So there may be a task to liberate, but then what would be the task beyond liberation? What's the task of living with that sense of being freed, responsible to yourself and to other people, to create a society out of that, a covenantal order, right? Right? So there is something beyond being the agent who speaks to liberation or the experience. And that's liberation, obviously, is a caesural moment for the people, but it's still not yet a moment in which people have to make a decision, say, yes, I will live this way to protect life, or to protect property, or protect value, or to protect divine honor, so I don't turn things into idols, right? All of the things, I won't cheat and lie and kill and steal and desire and whatever, or I will be able to give legal expression so that people can have maximum lives of safety, right? We don't have that yet, right? So the Sinai, the moment of Moses becomes the Sinai moment because it's a second caesural moment, right? It's the moment in which there's simply the thunder and the lightning and all of that raw issues that then emerges with a divinely voiced speech that comes through an individual, either actually or through tradition, however we want to discuss it. But that voice now is making a claim that transcends the individual person, right? It becomes a claim to a collectivity. In other words, it becomes from a form of life or a form of experience, it becomes a formulation that begins to make a social, moral, and theological claim upon a community, right? So scripture obviously is intending something of that nature because the word for bush is sneh and the word for Sinai is Sinai, and they play on each other. The rabbis later make a lot of that, but already you don't even need to know that to feel that already in the Hebrew text. In other words, one is for the self and one becomes for the community. And one becomes a voice that changes individual destiny, another becomes a voice that changes communal destiny. And it becomes this ongoing need of the community to give voice to something that keeps them at that axial point where the destiny of being liberated and freed creates a new responsibility for what it means to live with other people. Right? It's not only a different commitment to the divine voice, but it's immediate commitment to beginning with one's parents and then to everything that expands outward from at the social level. Begins to establish spiritual and moral boundaries and responsibilities that come from the inner self, but then also can be adjudicated in formal legal terms, right? Formal legal terms. If this happens, then that happens, right? That's already a hypothetical. The Ten Commandments are not hypotheticals; they're direct voices. And there's a distinction between that immediate claim that is pivotal to consciousness, and then the implications of that is for the hypotheticals of life situations, right? Which will attempt presumably to preserve life and property and honor and so on and so forth, and divine honor, but do that through these hypotheticals, which are themselves archetypes of potential events in the world, but they preserve that crossing point. Let me make one further point, and then we can talk about this issue of pardes as I was intending it. This point is, so we see that we have really three balls in play, right, for all of us, if you choose. One ball is yourself in the world. The other ball is the written tradition that you choose to accept or don't accept, or however you want to deal with that. And then the third ball in the air is how the two go together, right? What do you do with that when you're reading? So you always remain embedded in the world, but once you become part of the tradition, you also want to read and act within the framework of the tradition. So reading means that I have to receive these narratives as living moments, receive the laws as having an authoritative claim, or think about them or reinterpret them, however the issue is. So the three, it's a triad. It's a threefold. The self is never factored out. The world is never factored out at all. God keeps giving that Torah clue, that world of all in all. But then there are these settled deposits, or we call the settled law, right? Sinai gives us the first notion of what's called settled law, formulation. The oral tradition moves from the oral to another kind of settled law that becomes instantiated through life, not just through a divine voice, but through human living. And then the ongoing voice that speaks and interprets, which is going to constantly be that shuttlecock that moves between the two. It makes the individual or the social claim real or actual as we're going on. So the form of theology that I then chose to develop, because it doesn't exist like this anywhere, all of this is to try to use the pardes, which are 4 levels of traditional reading of scripture. Because remember, from the very beginning, part of the crisis, remember, was scripture undergoes a huge epistemological and cultural crisis after Spinoza, right? The issue of authority, the issue of meaning, the issue of interpretation, et cetera, all the issue of criticism, and then all these attempts. Maimonides is trying to integrate it with Aristotle, and so is trying to integrate it with that. But a lot of these things have they're just idols strewn along the way at this point, because those don't work. You don't live in an Aristotelian consciousness anymore, and I don't think people are going to read scripture from a Neo-Platonic or a Neo-Kantian perspective, right? So what are you left with? Just a series of fragments, right? Is there any cohesion to the fragments? Whether those fragments are isolated texts, or the fragments are just a series of coordinates along the line. So how can we rebuild a sense of authority for scripture? So one of the ways that I have moved into that from a hermeneutical point of view is through this issue of the four traditional levels of interpretation called pardes. Pshat, the straightforward contextual level of reading, right? Then the D for Drash, which is the rabbinic associative level of theological or legal interpretation, where one reads intertextually. Pshat is when you're reading textually along the line of a specific sentence. The sense of drash is when you need more than one text and you have to read intertextually for theological or legal purposes. Remez refers to the hints or the allegorical, or the sense that there's a deeper meaning hidden in the text from maybe a philosophical tradition or something, and you have to kind of crack the chestnut open to find what scripture is really talking about, that God speaks one way in public and another way in secret to the elite. And then the much larger notion of sod, which is the mystical or symbolic way of, because that already opens us up to a cosmic theology. Pshat gives us something on the ground, individual on the ground. Drash gives us the text of community. That the Remez gives us a theological superstructure or an intellectual superstructure. And the Sod opens you again to a cosmic consciousness. And I think that we as moderns don't simply privilege one or the other. Throughout the Middle Ages up to the modern period, people would privilege one or the other. One type of interpretation over the other, or a combination of two. But I think the contemporary person receives scripture through multiple levels of reception and multiple levels of authority. And all of these levels are making different kind of claims, and I'm trying to create a more synergistic model rather than one top-down, whether you're a philosopher and you go one way, or you're a Talmudist and you go another way, or maybe you combine two things together, Pshat and rabbinics, or are you moving up a hierarchy? I want to talk about a more dynamic, synergistic. But part of this issue is an attempt to reclaim the truth and the living truth of Scripture within the framework of our modern epistemological modernist crisis, or at least it's a crisis for me. If it's not a crisis for people and they're not bothered by it, then it's not a crisis. So part of this, part of the issue then is to try to, since you can't separate Jewish religious culture from its forms of reading, it's inseparable, because the forms of reading produce forms of life and forms of belief. So you have to go back to the primary forms of reading. What were the primary forms of reading or interpretation or hermeneutics that cultivated different ways of living? And I'm trying to do this in a modernist theological sense, that what are the ways of reading, readapting and reinterpreting these four levels that give us that the training of reading is a training for moral awareness, and that is life, and then a training for theological awareness, right? It's an attempt to kind of use Scripture as a scripture. It's something that's given, and that is affected also by interpretation, but then to use that as a primary experience that allows you to become attentive to the world at the moral, social level, because you're always reading and interpreting. And then it cultivates a theological consciousness and awareness. So let me just briefly go through some of this so you get a sense of that, and then we can open up for some questions. So again, this is a kind of form of my doing theology at this next level of Jewish hermeneutical theology. That one has to receive the language of tradition in its various forms. It's written in its oral forms, which are written down now, and one has to continue that tradition. So if you're always interpreting, and that's your hermeneutical imperative is primary, how does that affect your state of mind? How does that affect the way you see the world? And how does that affect then how you live theologically at multiple levels? Because my claim is that we all live at multiple levels of consciousness, because we read at multiple levels of consciousness. That's the concern of that second part. That's the phenomenological and theological challenge. So let me just be very brief, because it's a big issue. So we start with the level of pshat. That's the straightforward, so-called plain sense. It's not literal. It's not the sensus literal. It's not literal. There's no literal level. You always have to put words into, but it's how you make sense by putting things into context, the straightforward context. And that will determine whether something is read more literally or metaphorically or whatever its reference is. There's no simple, literal, straightforward thing. It's in the process of reading. And so you have to do that with great attentiveness to the sequence of words and sounds and how meaning is created and how you are a creator of that meaning, right? It's again, this consciousness of yourself as an active agent of meaning. Even at the level, at whatever level you're reading, even at this primary level, it makes sense because you're giving sense, because you're making, it makes sense because you're making sense, right? So with all these things, the themes that we've been talking about before, there's this given, and then there's also the cultural reformation of that. So that you become attentive to sequence, you become attentive to context, you become attentive. Then, so what is the implication of that at the level of life, at the level of moral social life, right? It's the way you read the world, the way you draw conclusions, the kinds of sequences and semantics that you give the world in the everyday, because you're also reading the world that's being cultivated by you as a reader of scripture as a primary religious exercise, right? So you read slowly and patiently, and you try to see how one thing connects with the other, right? And that form of attentiveness also has theological implications. It's being attentive to the mystery and the givenness of the divine creation. It's being attentive to how things are contextualized, the kind of theological integration of things, right? You see how that spectrum hangs together. So then there is also this fundamental level called drash or midrash, right? Midrash can be a theological midrash, or it can be halachic and legal midrash. Those are primary categories from the earliest rabbinic period, but they continue, right, for thousands of years, even to today. But what midrash does is it has a twofold quality. The very verb darash means inquiry. It's a textual inquiry, but it also means to seek God at the same time. It's theologically inflected, and it is scripturally inflected. You have to divine the meaning. You have to search out the meaning. It's not necessarily at the first level. You have to draw associations. You have to make intertextual connections. You have to read with implications. Right? All the you might have certain kind of rules of reading. Right? It's a whole huge dimension of that rabbinic aspect of how you read with reading scripture with other scripture to draw a theological conclusion, to draw a legal conclusion, to expand the law or to narrow the law, to clarify a biblical statement by another biblical statement. That is drash, and it cultivates an attentiveness to sameness and difference at the same time, right? Intertextuality is related to sameness and difference simultaneously. So when I step out of the world of my text, I'm also attentive to thinking associatively, which is midrashic thinking. You're thinking associatively. I'm thinking with sameness and difference. I'm thinking through correlation. Midrashic thinking is correlative, linking things up, associating things, right? So these are fundamental ways of coordinating things. So that's, and at the level of life, right? At the social and ethical imperative level, even before we're talking about, obviously this gives rise to a formal religious literature, but at the personal level, as I'm reading the world, I have to be aware of how I'm making associations. What is the implication of a correlation? What is the moral and spiritual nature of sameness and difference at the same time? This is like this. Midrash works, this is like this. Well, why is it like this? What is the sameness and difference of this is like this? Or this is this, if it's a metaphor. Why this is this? What is the implication of drawing things into conjunction? Right? And I'm doing that at every level that I'm making a ethical and moral judgment between myself and the world and you. And then there is that further level in which that has theological implications, right? Right? On what basis do I draw inferences about God, right? That this leads me to an associative thing that this can be like God, or I can make an implication of God because of this, right? On what basis do I do that? On what basis do I talk about God with sameness and difference? God is like a person, but he's not a person. The imagery of personhood is like, but it's different. What about will? What about speech? What is likeness and difference? How dare I say that God is looks like, an anthropomorphic thing or an anthropopathic thing? What is the likeness and the difference so that I can actually say something, think something, but not get trapped into mental idolatries, right? If I'm reading a text and it says God, does something and it's using personal language, well, what's going on here when that's being put into human terms? The book of Psalms is a human response to all kinds of theological experiences. What is the reality of those claims of that language? Right? How do I become aware of that so that my actions, so I'm always drawing a configuration of God based on the analogy of the world. If I go beyond analogy in the world, then I'm beyond language. So I'm stuck. But this issue of Darash is making me think about that, even at the theological level. What's the status of a comparison? What's the status of an image? What does it mean to pray or to be silent? What's going on when you're using words? You're using words to create connection with a person, and you may use religious language to create a kind of prismatic connection with the divine. But what does that mean? What do you mean by that? You can't just lie in your bed and be silent, or even Maimonides only did that for a couple of seconds a night. Who knows what was going on in his head. So what do you do? What do you do? Right? In Rosenzweig terms, to what primary event does this language in the Psalms give expression to? Right? What's there that's coming to expression that I don't want to become literal about it, but I need the language in any case? That is where the Midrashic thinking has moral, ethical claims, and it's training me to think more reflectively theologically. It's a theology that's also helping me think hermeneutically in theology. That's not giving me the answer, right? I can't leap to the answer. What is the thread of language, which is the thread of drash? And then if I get to remez, when I'm reading remez, there's a presumption that something is a clue. Well, how in heaven's name do I know something is a clue? A clue of what? Where do you start to say that something's a clue? And if you don't start a game called Clue, right? But how do you start and know something's a clue? You have to already have a presumption of a context. You have to have a presumption that there's something that's a clue of, that it's an allegory of. Where would you start with that? Well, tradition may say that this word is a clue of, who knows, the active intellect. Well, you only know that because you're projecting the active intellect into scripture, right? What is it saying? Does that work anymore? It's a clue of that. So Maimonides or any of the mystics will talk, how do you collect clues so it makes any sense? What would be the coherence of clues? What's the coherence of traces? There's all this philosophical trace, right? So traces are actually an old mystical term. Levinas uses trace, but what is trace of what? In what sense is it what is a trace of what? How do you assume that it's a trace? A trace of God? How would you know it's a trace of God? What is the context that makes you leap and say that something is a trace of something? That it's an outer trace, or a clue, or a hint, a remez, right? So you gotta have to be a living person. You have to be thinking. You have to act, obviously. You have to make a decision to act. But learning how to read and the implications of drawing assumptions about reading means I'm also going to make assumptions about what it means for me to relate to you, right? I have to be very careful to draw something in a clue. If I look at your face, what am I supposed to assume? Can I draw that you're happy, that you're sad, that you're withdrawn, that you're shy? And so how do I respond to that? Is that a clue there? It may be a clue for so-and-so, but why would that be a clue that I have to read from you? Or are you giving me cues, right? And then you're saying, you're a dope, you're not my friend because you're not reading the cues I'm giving you. How would I supposed to know that it's giving me a cue? Do I have to have a prior relationship before I know that it's a cue? Or a sign? Or a hint? Give me a hint, right? So what in scripture, does it have a deeper meaning? How would I know? How do I begin to determine that there's a hidden meaning there? What would be that second order revelation or philosophical disclosure for Maimonides that scripture is really talking about Aristotelian metaphysics? Right? That Moses received that revelation at Sinai. Right? So that's a philosophical presumption. And it only works to the extent at which that becomes philosophically coherent to the exegesis. And then it's also coherent if that worldview makes any sense. Right? Or neo-Kantian stuff. So people jibber-jabber about all these cues and what it's really meaning. But The hermeneutical reflexivity means you have to try to figure this out and think about it as a real moral and spiritual imperative. And then when I go out into the world, that has real life ethical implications, right? If I'm talking to you, how do I know that we're in the dialogue, that I'm drawing the right inference before I ask you something and you answer me? Do I need I need a dialogue. I need a living context for that. How would I know it from a tree that that's a gift of God? How would I know that? How would I know that there's the secret light of God shining through flowers? Where would be my context for that? But then I move from the ethical, so hermeneutics is the training in reading to the training in moral ethical reflexivity. And then it's also the training, it's a spiritual exercise. Hermeneutics is a spiritual exercise, right? And then it's a move towards thinking about God that way, right? Hints, cues, maybe just a trace of this or that, not drawing any big conclusions. What can be read off the surface? Or is it a cue of something at the depth? So who do I turn to trust that that is really the case? Experience? Someone else's experience? Another theological tractate? It may be, it may work. A person who says they've got a revelation from God, that's what it really means. Okay. But that's the question that's coming, that's forced upon you when hermeneutics is a spiritual exercise of thinking and reflection. And then you get to the level of Sod, right? So Sod then says, well, so that's the mystery of being. It's the symbolic levels of things. So the symbolic level is that, right? It instantiates something that transcends that term. But you also have to have some kind of a grammar of symbols to know what's going on here, right? Why would the tree be a symbol of a cosmic structure? Why? It means something different if you read the descriptions of the cosmic tree of Ananda Kumaraswamy, or you read it from the Kabbalah. Is it a tree upside down, or roots in heaven, or is it a tree that grows on the ground? And what grows out of the tree? Why is the tree a symbol? How would it work? Does it talk? Okay. So when I'm reading the text, how would I determine what's a symbol? What would open me to a cosmic dimension? That would be that language is a prism for a different level of consciousness. It's not just what it's saying at the surface, but it's a prism, it's a window to another level of consciousness. And then I go outside and I see you. So what are you a symbol of? Just yourself? Are you a symbol of human being? Are you a symbol of the mystery of life? Or are you simply an instantiation of the whole mystery of existence? And how do I move from what I'm seeing in the world, or even my poetic symbolic symbolization of things, right? Even a person like Rilke, in Sonnet so often, the symbols are all over the place, but he's counting on the fact that they speak to you. What part of Mala would be symbolic? Of what? How could a musical phrase be symbolic? And it is. But how? So where is it taking you? Towards the transverbal, to the divine. And then, so if it's taking you to the ineffable, so then how do you work that into a theological position, a theological orientation, right? Where does the ineffable stand in a world of effability? What's the tension? What's the crossing point? So from that point of view, hermeneutical theology is a spiritual practice of constant reflection. Now, obviously, at any point, you have beliefs and commitments. You're not always treading water about this. We're talking as a practice, but it's a practice that's cultivating mind and heart and soul. And you also have to do things, right? At a certain point, the religious person has commandments and tasks. But what are they referring to? What are they embodying? What are they symbolizing? What are they cues of? Are they just at the surface, right, of a commandment? Maybe some things just have to be that, or maybe they're more. But I'm not, so I'm just keeping that as an open issue. But the issue then of a hermeneutical theology is to move from the theological to the Jewish theological. But the creative aspect of hermeneutical theology is that you're always in process. You're always thinking. You're always living and doing. You're always integrating, right? All the things that I've been talking about. You're living with integrity, integration, right? Trying to make things work, right? That's part of the theological task. I have to act, but what is the reference of my act? Am I just responding to doing my religious duty? What is it? What is happening in the world of meaning? A cue, right? So hermeneutical theology means I still have to make meaning, but I'm also using this as a ritual process of mindfulness. It's a mindfulness because it's a practice. Itself is a practice. Hermeneutics itself is a ritual practice, not just its conclusions. But then it's also takes me out into the world where everything that I'm doing is challenged. So in that sense, it's multi-leveled and open-ended without ever ceasing to be authoritative from within a particular cultural point of view. Each person at that point has to decide how much of this is God and how much of this is person. If you read my theology carefully, you'll see how I try to walk that issue. But everybody's going to have to, right? Right? At Sinai, it already says, right? Moses spoke and God answered with a voice. What does that mean? There's a huge literature on that, but it's coming to the core of this question. That's the core of the question. And Rabbi Akiva answered that differently than Rabbi Ishmael. Right? There are very big differences, but that's the core. What is the human side and what is the human side, the divine side? And are the two integral, and how? Right? So all of that is part of one's training to be a religious person. And part of the claim is that this theological enterprise is the way I do it. And it's articulated so that you could see a model of another way of thinking about these things, right? It's not take it or leave it. You have to take some of it to criticize me in your paper, right? But all of these are just simply provocations for you to think for yourself, right? That's part of what the prompt paper is. Use me as a way of thinking, as a foil for thinking. Think with me, or think against it. But think, right? That's the issue. And then to see that these levels there's no distinction between how I interpret the world, how I interpret texts, and how I go back and interpret the world again, right? They're all integral. And all of this, from this theological point of view, is living in engaged response to the divine voice, which is always and everywhere. So that's the point where I get to in this book, but it's not necessarily where you have to go or may even want to go or could go. But that's irrelevant. I mean, there's This is an American theology that's embedded in 2,500 years of rabbinic tradition. But it's a particular person's voice. Right? Yeah. And maybe, let me stop with one other thing. So I talked at the very beginning that one of the decisions was to write some of this to give to my sons so that they could say, you don't have to give up on anything and bring it back to the tradition. But now, almost all of you out there may not be married and have kids, right? So the notion of a tradition has certain things for some of you because you have parents, hopefully. But I had to make a different decision about this, as you will, when you may have kids and you have to say, what is worth transmitting? What's really hits me in the gut so I have to transmit it, right? But I'm not just marching in lockstep, but I have to transmit it. I'm an agent of transmission, not in the abstract sense that someone's going to see how I'm acting and they're going to imitate me, or they're going to ask me and say, no, Abba, do you really mean that? You're telling me, right? What's going on here? So, some of the things I think the rubber hits the road at everybody's age. And I was feeling these crisis things when I was your age too, but the rubber hits the road differently as you go along the life spectrum and at different ways that it affects you. So it's not something that's once and done, right? Because we're talking about something that's alive and it has to be made true through your own truth. So that's part 2 of Sacred Attunement. We have about 10 minutes, so why don't we, yes, Brian, please.
Yeah, I had a question. It's a little bit on the technical side, but it's kind of regarding the emergence of these exegetical techniques among the sages and the rabbis. I was kind of wondering what initiated the emergence of, I guess you just call it the Pardes. Was it kind of this caesural moment of the rabbis that they kind of realized, oh, our religious practices and techniques have gotten to a kind of routine and monotonous level, and we need to reinvigorate a life into it. So we are going to, integrate this form of darash or peshat into our practice or into our reading, because that is what speaks to me. So I was kind of wondering if it was more on that side that these forms emerged, or if it was something else.
All right, so there are a number of levels. First, let me answer it at a more traditional level. At the more traditional level is that rabbinic tradition has cultivated the belief from the 2nd century on, it's not an original belief, that all these forms of understanding were given to Moses already at Sinai, right? So it's not a primary thing, but it's something that emerged in history at a certain moment. Part of what's being claimed in that statement is that there are authentic forms of interpretation and less authentic forms of interpretation. The authentic forms of interpretation are passed down by tradition. And that is always already somehow mysteriously coexistent with the written text. So as the text is not something that I just create out of whole cloth, I don't have the right to do it. I have to become part of a chain of tradition. So that has theological implications. From the side that you are asking, the fact is that the rabbis were faced with, in many cases, with very difficult sentences. And they wanted to understand, it was a task of understanding and connecting sentences with other sentences and meanings with other meanings, and making sense of the laws that might look to be contradictory, but then you can find ways to harmonize them or expand them or contract them, right? Where'd you disagree? So there's the struggle. Now, between you and me, or it's beyond you and me, this struggle to find these types of meanings, they actually looked to their world. So I could show you, not here, because we don't have the time, but the types of rules of rabbinic interpretation, which have been passed down as the rules by which the Torah is divided, were actually derived from Roman rhetoric, to particular forms of Roman rhetoric, and to other forms of Greco-Roman dream interpretation. Those they were established rules of how to read and interpret. The rabbis were in a living world, and they adapted it in many different ways. Yeah. So that's a historical explanation. Now, it's not, the caesura is every moment that I don't understand, I'm trying to understand, right? And the kind of rules of reading grow up because people are aware of Greco-Roman rhetoric, and they're also aware of the necessity of an authoritative tradition and the need to resolve and to harmonize and to learn how to read, right? And then you begin to read at multiple levels in different ways, right? That's not to say that different people may not have felt inspired to speak in different ways, but at any particular time, a person like Rabbi Akiva had a maximalist notion that every single jot and tittle has meaning, and Rabbi Ishmael says, no, it's just the way we normally make sense, right? And then they decide, well, okay, that's one thing, but what is it about if you're dealing with the law? Is it the same thing as the law, or you're dealing with a moral question, right? Anyway, and an allegorical issue might come through philosophical insight, and the mystical ones were always claimed to be a secret chain of tradition that come down either from Moses or Enoch or Abraham. But that's a whole other issue, okay? In other words, it's a more esoteric level. And I am sure that those seem to be, are claimed to have been revealed by what's called in Hebrew, Gilui Eliyahu. They were revelations of Elijah, okay? So the tradition itself is very complex. Some have revelatory, some are intuitive. But the larger claim of the tradition is that it comes with Sinai, because the issue is to say, you're not going to, you can't import interpretation from someplace else. You have to try to bring it from within the tradition. But it's a complicated dialectic. Okay. So Seth had his hand up.
Yeah. Perhaps this is a question that'll be addressed more in the second half of the book, but I was wondering, beyond just being a theology addressing a modern context, how you think your writing is like a specifically American modern theology, in the sense that like beyond just being a product of the American environment, is there anything about your theology that you think like addresses the specifically American modern context, as opposed to like the Israeli modern Jewish context or something like that?
I can only say that it comes out of whatever authenticity I try to live as an American who is deeply embedded in all the levels of Jewish classical Jewish literature, and have read quite a bit in Western and other, and but now it's coming through a Jewish voice. Who it responds to, people may share parts of this or not other parts. It may not be their live question. As about the Israeli aspect, part of that will be seen. While we're sitting here, the book is ready to come out in Hebrew translation in Jerusalem, so we'll soon find out. But I already know from the way it's been received in certain kind of study groups already in Hebrew translation, that there's a different, there's a resonance within different cultural forms. So in Israel, when I was working on the translation with a colleague, we had to try to find a new spiritual language, right? So in modern Hebrew, that was the task that we were trying to do, because it wasn't simply trying to reach traditional religious people who would read it at one level or not read it, whatever the case may be, or read it with preset associations. And if you use traditional language, we knew that all the spiritual seekers in Israel, many of whom are secular, would throw the book away because it's using language that they're in revolt against, right? For secular reasons. So the question was, could you we tried to work very hard to find a new form of Hebrew. I worked very hard at that so that the language would work and be attractive to the spiritual seeker who was secular and bring them into a religious context, but without all the baggage that they bring to traditional language. So from that point of view, the only thing I could say about this is, I think probably you found that parts were harder than others, part had to be reread maybe, but as with poetry or other things, theology also has to have its own language. If I was just going to speak newspaper speak, it wouldn't have. In other words, I went to the wall with every word that I could. Every word I believe, every ambiguity I believe, right? So the question is, when you're writing theology, the question it may be harder for other people to read because they're also not inside my head, and but it's precisely because the clusters of my experience and the way I choose to speak is me. A reader, in a certain sense, has to suspend and try to stay with that language and see whether it will work, right? And maybe for a lot of you it didn't work, or maybe for some of you it worked, maybe for some of you it worked in pieces. That's your decision to make. So that's what's involved. I really can't know. I know it has a very it retains a very idiosyncratic quality, but that's because you wouldn't expect a poem to speak, street speak and talk about what it's trying to speak about. So every authentic creation has to have its own language, while still trying to be social and communicative. That's it. So I think I succeeded and failed in some ways in Sacred Attunement. I hope I succeeded in the ways I failed in the new book, Fragile Finitude, but we'll see. I have no way of knowing. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yeah. All right. So I'll let you take this with you or not, as you choose. Look forward to some papers. Please write your paper. Don't worry about me. I can handle it. I'm well put together, so I'm not gonna. But so you just do what you need to do so that it's your paper, okay? I want you to kind of think along with the text, so it helps you to think in whatever it does. And in the meantime, you should go outside and enjoy yourselves a little if you can. Otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.